He thought it would be an easy laugh, the kind that echoes for a few seconds and disappears, but he had no idea that in less than a minute, no one in that room would dare make a sound. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. And if you believe respect matters more than appearances, stay with this story, because what happened next changed everything. The shooting range sat just outside town. A long concrete space lit by harsh white lights, the air steady, controlled, filled with the quiet rhythm of practice and precision. Regulars lined the lanes, confident, relaxed, each one carrying themselves like they belonged there, especially Brad Collins, who stood near the center with his group, laughing a little louder than necessary, his voice cutting through the room like he owned it. He was the kind of man who didn't just shoot well, he needed everyone to know it. And the people around him followed that energy, nodding, smirking, feeding off his confidence. Then the door opened, and for a brief moment, no one paid attention. Emily Carter stepped inside quietly, her gray hoodie slightly oversized, her jeans simple, her presence unremarkable in every way that mattered to people like Brad. She didn't walk in like she had something to prove. She walked in like she had somewhere to be, her eyes steady, taking in the space without lingering too long on anyone. And that alone made her different. But difference wasn't something that earned respect in that room. It invited judgment. Brad noticed her within seconds, his eyes narrowing slightly before the corner of his mouth lifted into a smirk. It was almost automatic, the way he looked her up and down, deciding who she was without a single word exchanged. Well, this should be interesting, he muttered just loud enough for his group to hear. And just like that, attention shifted, a few heads turned, subtle at first, then more obvious as Emily approached the counter, her voice calm, as she asked for a lane. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, but Brad stepped forward before the staff could respond, inserting himself into the moment like he always did. "You sure you're in the right place?" he said, his tone wrapped in a casual kind of condescension that didn't need to be loud to be heard. A couple of people chuckled, not because it was funny, but because it was expected. Emily didn't react, not immediately. She simply glanced at him, her expression unreadable, and that seemed to bother him more than if she had argued, because silence, in a room built on noise and ego, felt out of place. "This lane's for experienced shooters," Brad continued, gesturing behind him, his voice gaining confidence as the room leaned into the moment. "Beginners usually start somewhere. Easier." More laughter followed, sharper this time, and still, Emily said nothing. She just nodded once, almost politely, as if acknowledging a comment that didn't matter. And that was the first moment something shifted, subtle, almost invisible, but real, because while everyone else saw someone out of place, someone to dismiss, someone to entertain themselves with for a few minutes, Emily Carter stood there completely unaffected, as if none of it had anything to do with her. And that kind of calm doesn't come from inexperience. It comes from knowing exactly how this ends, even when no one else does. And somewhere in that room, beneath the laughter and the noise, the air tightened just slightly, like the moment before something changes, though no one realized it yet. Not even Brad, not even close. The clerk behind the counter hesitated for just a second, glancing between Emily and Brad, as if deciding which version of the moment mattered more, the quiet request or the loud interruption. And in places like this, it was almost always the louder voice that won. "We do have an open lane at 25 yards, the clerk said cautiously, but Brad let out a short laugh before the sentence could settle. 25 yards might still be generous, he added, shaking his head as if he was doing everyone a favor by saying what others were thinking. A few people shifted closer now, drawn in by the tension, not wanting to miss whatever came next. Emily placed her ID on the counter without a word, her movement steady, unhurried, and that calm only seemed to fuel Brad's need to push further, because silence, to him, felt like resistance. "Tell you what," he continued, stepping slightly into her space. "Not enough to be obvious, just enough to assert presence. Why do not we make this interesting?" His tone changed, lighter on the surface, but sharper underneath. "You take a shot at the far target, full distance, and if you even hit the board, I will personally apologize." The word apologize lingered just long enough to sound like a joke. More laughter followed, louder now, more confident, because the setup felt safe, predictable, a performance they had all seen before. Someone steps out of place, Someone gets reminded where they belong. Emily finally looked at the target he pointed to. A small circle set farther down the range, its edges barely visible under the bright overhead lights. She studied it for a moment. Not long. Just enough, then shifted her gaze back to the counter. "I will take that lane," she said quietly, ignoring the challenge completely. And that was when the energy in the room shifted again, sharper this time, because she had not played along. She had not accepted or refused. She had simply moved forward. And that kind of response leaves people like Brad with nowhere comfortable to stand. So he doubled down. "Come on," he said, louder now, drawing in the last few onlookers. "Do not back out now. Everyone is watching." He gestured around. And sure enough, phones were out. Whispers circling, anticipation building, the kind that feeds on embarrassment, the kind that expects a mistake. Emily picked up her safety gear, adjusting it with practiced ease. A small detail that went unnoticed by most, but not by everyone. One older man near the back narrowed his eyes slightly, watching her hands, the way she handled each step without hesitation, without uncertainty. But the moment passed quickly under the noise of the room. Brad leaned against the divider, arms crossed, already enjoying the outcome he believed was inevitable. "One shot," he said, almost like a command now, as if setting the rules made him in control of the result. Emily paused for just a second before stepping into the lane, the overhead lights casting a clean line across the floor, separating observation from action. She stood there, still, her posture relaxed but grounded. And for the first time since she walked in, the room began to quiet. Not completely, but enough, because something about stillness in a place built on movement forces people to pay attention. And even though they did not understand why, they leaned in, waiting, watching, expecting the same outcome they had already decided in their heads, unaware that the moment they were about to witness was not going to follow any of their expectations at all. Emily's fingers rested lightly along the frame, not gripping, not forcing, just settling into place as if she had done this 1,000 times before. And for a brief second, the room seemed to forget how to breathe. Brad shifted his weight, still confident, but now watching more closely, because something about her stance did not match the story he had already decided. "Any time now," he called out, trying to pull the moment back under his control. A few scattered chuckles followed, but they were thinner this time, less certain. Emily did not respond, her eyes fixed downrange, not just looking but measuring. The distance, the alignment, the quiet rhythm of the space. Everything narrowing into a single point that only she seemed to understand. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even. And then, almost casually, she made her first attempt. A clean motion, smooth but understated, the result landing just off-center. Close enough to be respectable, but not enough to impress the crowd that had already decided what success looked like. And just like that, the noise came rushing back, louder than before, because now they felt justified. "There it is," Brad laughed, clapping once as if the outcome had been proven. "That is what I expected." Someone behind him muttered, phones lowered, interest fading, the moment already written off as predictable. But Emily did not step away. She did not react to the laughter or the comments. She simply remained where she was, her gaze still forward, her posture unchanged. And that was when the older man in the back leaned slightly forward, his expression tightening as he watched her reset. Because what happened next was not the behavior of someone discouraged. It was the behavior of someone adjusting, refining, preparing. Emily exhaled slowly, her grip shifting by the smallest margin, a detail so subtle most would miss it entirely. But it changed everything. The line of her stance sharpened, her focus deepened, and without raising her voice, without turning around, she spoke. That one did not count. The words were quiet, but they carried, not as an excuse, not as a defense, but as a statement. And for the first time, no one laughed immediately. The delay was small, barely a second, but it was enough to plant doubt where certainty had been. Brad frowned slightly, just for a moment, before forcing a grin back onto his face. "Oh, we are making rules now," he said, trying to recover the tone, but it did not land the same way, because the room had shifted, the energy no longer fully on his side. Emily adjusted her stance one final time, her movements precise, economical, nothing wasted. and the difference was unmistakable. Even to those who did not understand why, the air seemed to tighten again, that same quiet pressure. Building, the kind that comes right before something irreversible happens. And then she moved. Not fast, not dramatic, just exact, a single controlled motion that ended in a moment so clean it almost felt effortless. The sound that followed was sharp but brief, echoing just long enough to be heard and then gone, replaced immediately by something far louder, silence, complete and absolute. The kind that fills a room when every expectation collapses at once. No one spoke, no one laughed, no one even shifted, because downrange, the result was undeniable, not just accurate, not just impressive, but precise in a way that did not leave room for explanation. And somewhere behind Brad, the older man whispered under his breath, "That is not beginner shooting." And this time, no one disagreed. No one moved. Not immediately, because moments like that do not register all at once. They ripple outward, slowly, forcing every person in the room to reconsider what they just witnessed. Brad's smile faded in pieces, first the corners of his mouth, then the tension in his jaw, until all that remained was a blank expression that did not know where to go next. He looked downrange, then back at Emily, then downrange again, as if repeating the motion might change the outcome, but it did not. It could not. The target told a story that no one could interrupt, a clean, undeniable result that sat there under the bright lights, silent but absolute. Someone took a step closer, then another, as if distance itself had become suspicious. The clerk leaned forward over the counter, squinting slightly, and even he, who had seen hundreds of shooters come and go, felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Because this was not luck, it was not chance, it was something else entirely, something practiced, something controlled, something that did not belong to someone who had just been laughed at seconds earlier. "Check the alignment," Brad said suddenly, his voice tighter now, searching for ground to stand on. Maybe the target shifted. The words came out faster than he intended, and for the first time, they sounded less like confidence and more like hope. The clerk hesitated, then nodded, walking down the side path to verify, each step echoing softly against the concrete. The room watching him the way they had watched Emily, waiting, needing an explanation, any explanation. But when he reached the target and paused, really paused, the kind that stretches just a little too long, everyone already knew what was coming before he said it. He turned back slowly, shaking his head once, not dramatically, just enough. "It is clean," he called out, and the words settled into the room like a final verdict. No embellishment, no hesitation, just truth. Brad exhaled through his nose, a short breath that carried more weight than any of his earlier laughter. He looked at Emily again, but this time there was no smirk, no performance, just uncertainty, the kind that comes when someone realizes they have misjudged not just a person, but an entire situation. Emily lowered her hands, setting everything down with the same quiet control she had shown from the beginning. No celebration, no reaction, as if the result had been expected all along, and that was what unsettled them the most. Not the precision, not the silence, but the fact that to her, this was normal. The older man in the back stepped forward now, his voice calm but certain. "Where did you train?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as recognition. Emily glanced at him briefly, then back toward the exit, considering the question for a moment before answering. "Different places," she said simply, and that answer, vague as it was, carried more weight than a detailed explanation ever could, because it hinted at experience without needing to prove it. Brad swallowed, his confidence now replaced by something quieter, something closer to realization. He shifted his stance, uncrossing his arms as if letting go of a position he could no longer hold. And though no one said it out loud, the entire room understood the shift. The balance had changed, completely and irreversibly. And standing there in the middle of it, Emily Carter had not raised her voice once, had not argued, had not defended herself. She had simply waited, acted, and let the truth speak in a way that left no room for doubt. And in that silence, heavier now than any laughter that had come before, the room remembered exactly what respect looks like. Brad cleared his throat as if sound alone could restore control, but nothing came out the way it had before. The ease was gone, replaced by a carefulness he was not used to carrying. He took a step forward, then stopped, unsure whether to approach or retreat, and that hesitation, small as it seemed, said more than anything he could have said out loud. Because a man who had spent the last 10 minutes leading the room now could not even find his next move. That was a good shot, he managed. Finally, the words stiff, almost unfamiliar, and no one reacted. No laughter, no agreement, just silence. Because everyone understood that what they had witnessed was far beyond something that could be dismissed as good. The older man nodded slightly, his eyes still on Emily. That was discipline, he added quietly, and this time, the word carried, settling into the space with a different kind of weight. Not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. Emily adjusted her sleeve, a simple movement. Grounding, as if returning to something ordinary after a moment that had shifted everything around her. She did not look at Brad again, not because she was avoiding him, but because there was nothing left to address. The moment had already spoken, the outcome already decided, and continuing the exchange would only reduce what had just happened into something smaller than it deserved to be. The clerk returned to the counter, his posture different now, more attentive, more respectful. "Your lane is ready," he said, but the tone had changed, subtle, but clear, no longer cautious, no longer influenced by the voices around him. Just direct, professional. Emily gave a small nod, picking up her things without urgency, and as she turned slightly toward the exit, a few people shifted out of her path instinctively, not because she asked, not because she demanded it, but because something about her presence now carried a quiet authority that had not been there before, or perhaps had always been. There, simply unnoticed, Brad watched her move, his expression no longer guarded, just thoughtful, the kind of look that comes when someone realizes they have been measuring the wrong things all along. He opened his mouth as if to say something else, maybe to correct himself, maybe to recover a piece of the image he had built, but nothing came, because there was no version of words that could match what had already happened. The room slowly began to breathe again, conversations returning in low tones, but not in the same way. The energy had shifted, softer now, more aware, the kind of awareness that lingers. After a moment that forces people to rethink what they believe they understand, the older man stepped back, a faint smile forming, not of amusement, but of recognition, as if he had seen something familiar that others were only just beginning to comprehend. Emily reached the doorway, pausing for just a fraction of a second as the light from outside spilled across the floor, and without turning back, without claiming anything, she walked out the same way she had entered, quiet, steady, unchanged, leaving behind a room that would not forget what it had seen. And in that lingering silence, heavier now than any reaction could have been, one truth remained, clear and unshakable. Respect does not follow noise. It follows truth. And that day, everyone in that room learned the difference. The door closed softly behind Emily, and for a moment, no one inside the range moved, as if the space itself needed time to catch up to what had just happened. Brad remained where he stood, his eyes still fixed on the empty doorway, replaying the moment over and over, trying to find the point where he had misread everything. Because it had to be somewhere. It had to be something he missed, but the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that the mistake was not in the moment, it was in the assumption, the belief that he could measure someone in seconds based on nothing more than appearance. He let out a slow breath, running a hand along the back of his neck, a gesture that replaced the confidence he usually carried so easily. "I did not see that coming," someone said quietly behind him, and this time, no one laughed, because there was nothing amusing about being proven wrong so completely. The older man stepped closer to the lane Emily had used, studying the setup, the alignment, the distance, not because he doubted it, but because he respected it. "That kind of control takes years," he said, almost to himself, and Brad heard it, every word landing heavier than the last, because years was not something you could fake, not something you could stumble into. It was built, earned, refined in ways that do not show on the surface, and suddenly, the hoodie, the quiet voice, the lack of reaction, none of it meant what he thought it did. It meant the opposite. The clerk returned fully to his station, but even his movements had changed, slower, more deliberate, as if the entire room had been reset. A few of the regulars began talking again, but in lower tones. Their conversations no longer centered around performance or comparison, but around what they had just witnessed, trying to put it into words that felt accurate, but none of them quite managed it. Because moments like that resist explanation, they exist on their own terms. Brad glanced down range 1 more time, then back at his group, but the dynamic had shifted. No one was looking to him now for the next comment or reaction. No one was waiting for him to lead the tone, and that realization settled in quietly, without drama, but with undeniable clarity. He had lost something in that moment. Not status, not skill, but certainty, the easy confidence that came from believing he understood the room. He stepped back from the lane, his posture no longer claiming space, just occupying it, and for the first time that day, he said nothing at all. Outside, Emily walked across the parking lot, the late afternoon light stretching shadows across the pavement, the world beyond the range unchanged, unaware of the shift that had just taken place inside. She adjusted the strap of her bag and kept moving, her pace steady, her expression calm, as if nothing unusual had happened, because to her, it had not. It was simply another moment, another place, another reminder that people often speak before they see, judge before they understand, and underestimate what does not announce itself. And as she reached her car, pausing briefly before opening the door, there was no trace of victory, no need for it, because true mastery does not look for recognition. It leaves it behind, and back inside that range, long after she was gone, the silence she created did not fade. It settled, it stayed, it changed the way every person in that room would look at the next quiet figure who walked through that door, because some lessons do not need to be repeated, they only need to be witnessed once. The sun dipped lower outside, casting long golden lines across the parking lot as Emily drove away without a second thought. But back inside the range, the moment refused to leave. It lingered in the air, in the quiet glances, in the way conversations never quite returned to their original tone. Brad stood near the same lane, but it no longer felt like his space. It felt like somewhere he had been corrected, not loudly, not aggressively, but in a way that could not be ignored. One of the younger shooters stepped up beside him, looking downrange, then back at Brad. "You think she comes here often?" he asked, but the question was not casual. It carried curiosity now, respect even. Brad shook his head slowly. "No," he said, though it sounded less like an answer and more like a realization, because someone like that does not stay in one place long. They do not need to. They move through spaces, leaving impressions instead of explanations. The older man returned to his position, but before picking up his gear, he paused, turning slightly toward Brad. "You know," he said, his voice calm but firm, "people who know exactly what they are doing do not waste time proving it." Brad met his gaze, and for the first time, there was no resistance, no defensiveness, just understanding, because deep down, he recognized the truth in those words. It was not just about what Emily had done, it was about how she had done it, without argument, without ego, without needing the room to agree with her before she acted. And that was something Brad had never considered, because his entire presence had always been built on being seen, being acknowledged, being validated in real time. The difference between them was not just skill, it was perspective, and that difference now stood out in a way he could not unsee. He looked around the room again, but everything felt slightly altered, as if the lens he had been using no longer fit. The laughter from earlier replayed in his mind, but now it sounded hollow, misplaced, directed at someone who had never needed their approval in the first place. And that realization carried a quiet weight, the kind that does not disappear quickly, the kind that changes how you act the next time. The clerk finished logging something on the computer, then glanced up briefly, his eyes scanning the entrance as if expecting it to open again, as if part of him hoped for another chance to observe, to understand. But the door remained closed, and the absence itself became part of the lesson, because not every moment repeats itself. Not every person stays long enough to explain who they are. Some just appear, shift everything, and leave. Brad picked up his gear again, but his movements were slower now, more deliberate, less performative. He stepped into the lane, but this time, there was no commentary, no audience, just him and the quiet space ahead. And as he lined up his stance, something subtle changed, not in his hands, not in his posture, but in his mindset, because for the first time, he was not thinking about how he looked, he was thinking about how he performed, and that shift, small as it seemed, marked the beginning of something different, something quieter, something more real. And though he would never say it out loud, not to them, not to anyone, the truth had already settled in, clear and undeniable. The loudest person in the room is not always the most capable, and sometimes, the one who says the least is the one who changes everything. The rhythm of the range slowly returned, but it was no longer the same rhythm. It had lost its edge, its noise, replaced by something more measured, more aware, as if every movement now carried a second layer of thought behind it. Brad stood in his lane, steady, focused, but different, his breathing more controlled, his posture more intentional. And when he made his next attempt, there was no commentary, no glance over his shoulder to check reactions, just a quiet execution. The result was solid, respectable, the kind that would have earned approval earlier. But now, no one reacted, not because it was unimpressive, but because the standard in the room had changed, and that shift was undeniable. One of the regulars lowered his voice as he spoke to another. "Funny how one moment can reset everything," he said. And the other man nodded. "Eyes still on the target downrange." "Not funny," he replied. "Necessary." And that word lingered, because it captured what everyone felt but had not yet said out loud. The older man gathered his gear slowly, his movements deliberate, as if giving space for the lesson to settle fully. He glanced once more at the lane Emily had used, then back at the room. "You all saw it," he said, not raising his voice, but making sure it carried. "And you all know what it means." No one responded immediately, but no one needed to, because the meaning was already understood. It was in the way people stood now, the way they watched, the way they spoke less and observed more. Brad stepped back from his position, lowering his hands, not out of frustration, but out of recognition. He looked toward the entrance again, though he knew she was long gone, and for the first time, there was something close to respect in that glance. Not forced, not performative, just quiet and real. The clerk adjusted the logbook on the counter, his usual routine now carrying a new sense of attention, as if each person who walked in might carry more than what appeared on the surface. A young woman entered moments later, hesitating slightly as she looked around, and for a brief second, the room held its breath, not out of judgment, but out of awareness. The contrast was subtle but powerful, because no one laughed, no one commented, no one stepped forward to define her place before she had the chance to define it herself. And that silence, that restraint, was the echo of what Emily had left behind. Brad noticed it too, the absence of his own voice in that moment, the choice not to speak, not to assume, and that choice, more than anything else, marked the shift within him, because change does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives in what you decide not to do. The older man watched this unfold, a faint nod acknowledging the difference. "That is how it starts," he murmured, more to the moment than to any one person. And as the range continued, quieter, steadier, more grounded than before, the lesson settled deeper, not as a memory of embarrassment, but as a foundation for something better, something more honest, and somewhere far from that room, Emily drove on without a second thought, unaware that the silence she left behind had already begun to shape something larger than a single moment, because true impact is not measured by how long you stay, but by how deeply you are remembered after you leave. Weeks passed, but the story did not fade. It settled into the walls of the range, into the habits of the people who returned day after day, and though no one announced it, things were different now, quieter in the right ways, sharper where it mattered. Brad arrived one afternoon like he always did, but his presence no longer filled the room the same way. He nodded to the clerk, stepped into his lane, and began without a word, his movements steady, focused, and for the first time, entirely his own. No audience, no performance, just discipline. And that change did not go unnoticed. The younger shooters watched him, not for commentary, but for example, because the man who once filled the room with noise now carried something more valuable, control. The older man stood near the back again, observing with the same calm attention, and when Brad finished a clean, consistent sequence, he gave a small nod, not praise, not approval, just acknowledgement. And that was enough, more than enough. Because it was earned, not demanded. The door opened once more, and a new face stepped inside, unsure, quiet, taking in the space the same way Emily once had. And this time, no one laughed, No one spoke out of turn. The room held its balance, giving space instead of taking it. Brad glanced over briefly, then returned to his lane, choosing not to interrupt, choosing not to define someone before they had the chance to define themselves. And in that choice, the lesson completed itself, not through words, but through action, because respect is not proven in a single moment. It is practiced in every moment after. The clerk greeted the newcomer with a calm professionalism. No hesitation, no judgment, just a simple welcome, and the range carried on, steady, grounded, shaped by something invisible but undeniable, and somewhere beyond that building, Emily Carter continued her life as she always had, moving through spaces without announcement, leaving behind nothing but quiet shifts that others would only understand later. She never returned, never needed to, because her presence had already done what it was meant to do. And back inside that range, long after the sound of that single moment had faded, the silence it created remained, not empty, not forgotten, but full of something better, something earned, something real. And on that day, without ever asking for it, without ever staying to see it, she changed the room, and the room remembered.